Greetings. This lecture is on Islam and the Crusades. It's a fascinating topic, and I draw heavily on two scholars. On Islam, I have taken advantage of the scholarship of Bernard Lewis, and as far as the Crusades, I've drawn heavily on the work of Rodney Stark. In the Middle East region, after the decline and collapse of the classical empires, new societies rose to take their place. From its origins in Arabia, Islam quickly spread and eventually would cover over a cosmopolitan world ranging from Spain in the west to India in the east. Muhammad, born in the year 570 and who died in the year 632, was the founder of Islam. In his farewell address, he declared, quote, "I was ordered to fight all men until they say, 'There is no God but Allah.'" End of quote. The word Islam means, quote, the willing and active recognition of and submission to the command of the one Allah. End of quote. The five pillars of Islam that forms the basic obligations of the faith are, first, acknowledgement of Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Prayer to Allah while facing Mecca. 3. Fast during the holy month of Ramadan. 4. Alms for the weak and poor. And 5. A pilgrimage to Mecca at least once during a Muslim lifetime. Muhammad claimed to have a series of visions that he was Allah's prophet. He saw himself as the seal of the prophets. As the final prophet, he was the only one who recognized the complete revelation of Allah. His revelations from Allah, delivered through the agency of the angel Gabriel, were recorded in the Quran. And the Quran literally means recitation. After coming into conflict with leaders in Mecca, Muhammad led his followers to the north, to Medina, and that was in the year 622. This journey was the turning point in Muhammad's career. In Medina, he served as the religious, political, and social leader. In the year 630, Muhammad and his followers returned to the south, where they conquered Mecca. And there they destroyed the idols. Muhammad's insistence upon fidelity to Allah above all helped to unify an otherwise tribally divided people. Muhammad was a very strict monotheist, believing that Allah was the one true God. Muhammad's plan to unite Arabia and spread Islam beyond its borders were cut short by his death in the year 632. He allegedly declared on his deathbed, quote, "Let there not be two religions in Arabia." In Muslim eyes, one who leaves the faith and converts to another faith will receive no mercy. The offense is apostasy. If the apostate or renegade is a male, the penalty is death. If the renegade is a female, the punishment is flogging or imprisonment. Following Muhammad's death, political authority passed to Abu Bakr. Bakr was the caliph. In other words, the caliph, the translation being the successor and defender of the faith. And this began a tremendous century of expansion, of Islamic expansion. The conquest of Syria took place in the years 633 to 636. The Byzantine army failed to defeat the Muslims in several key battles in Syria. The Muslims were successful, and they made Damascus as their capital. Damascus became the capital of the Islamic Empire. Despite having an army of about 30,000, Persia was defeated in 636. The Persians were defeated by the Muslims. Eventually, the victors built the city of Baghdad, which became the new capital of the Islamic Empire. The empire grew to include Armenia, the Indus Valley, and parts of India. So in the east, we're talking Pakistan and parts of India. To the west, in the Holy Land, in other words, Palestine. In Palestine, Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in the year 638. Next was Egypt. Egypt was defended by the Byzantines, who made some serious military blunders. One disadvantage for the Muslim armies, in essence, one advantage that the Byzantines had in Egypt, was the defensive strength of Alexandria. Alexandria was outside, had these massive walls and towers, thus making the city a formidable obstacle for any invaders. But in the year 645, there was an act of treachery. An act of treachery that allowed the Muslims to enter an opened gate. And what followed was a massacre and the destruction of the city's walls. Lacking shipbuilding and navigable skills, the Muslims had Coptics and Greeks build and sail Muslim ships, which they used to invade Cyprus and Sicily. Now, their success in Cyprus and Sicily came later, but at least at this point they did invade. They did attempt to conquer, but that came later. Despite the military successes that they did have, and most of their military engagements were successful, political problems centering around the selection of caliphs remained a constant challenge. There was a fundamental split in Islam between the Sunni, who were known as the traditionalists, and Shia, the Shia party. And from this disagreement, from the split, we have the Sunni and the Shiites. The majority Sunni felt that leadership could be held by any true believer. Shia began as a sect which believed that the caliphate had to be in the hands of descendants of the assassinated fourth caliph, Ali. Ali was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. So there's a civil war that breaks out between the Sunni and the Shiites. And from the year 649 to the year 670, we see that this civil war stalls the expansion of the empire. Now, after 670, the Muslims began to advance westward, the Muslim armies westward along the North African coast. Not on the coast, but along it. The major cities on the coast had strong garrisons. Thus, the strategy of the Muslims was to take desert routes and establish inland bases that would be where they would have their future attacks, a springboard for future attacks against their enemies in the cities, in the coast. In the year 698, Carthage fell to the Muslims, but the Muslims didn't take permanent control because the Greeks had regrouped and they took the city back. In 705, the Muslims once again conquered the city of Carthage, but this time they destroyed much of the city, killing most of its inhabitants. And from that point on, they had control of Carthage. The Muslims gained a foothold in continental Europe when they crossed the Mediterranean Sea to Spain. That one spot, the west end of the Mediterranean Sea, very narrow, where you have Spain and Morocco. They crossed there and they surprised the people of Spain. Spanish leaders and the people were surprised by the landing. The king at the time was Rodrigo, and Rodrigo had quickly got his army together and they marched southward to meet the Muslim army, but it turned out to be the lead end up disaster for Spain, for the Spanish, because the Muslims were victorious, and actually Rodrigo lost his life in that encounter, that conflict. And supposedly the Muslim leader soaked Rodrigo's head in brine and sent it back to a caliph in Damascus. The Muslims and Christians fought each other in Spain for the next 7 years. Only a small region in northern Spain remained in the hands of Christians. In the city of Cordoba, the Muslims built a huge mosque where a Christian cathedral once stood. The Muslims then were very successful in Spain. Getting back to Sicily, the earliest invasions of Sicily were failures, but in the year 827, the Muslims began larger campaigns. Palermo was lost to the Muslims in 831, but Syracuse, the city of Syracuse, stayed in the hands of Christians until 878. Meanwhile, the Muslims did reach southern Italy. They reached southern Italy in the year 840, and they began to occupy much of the region. And this occupation lasted until about the mid-11th century. Well, what we see here is quite a success story military-wise. And a number scholars have come up with a number of reasons why the Muslims were so successful against their opponents. Now, their opponents were primarily Christians. In the east, these would be the Byzantine Christian, the Eastern Church. Further to the east, their opposition would have been the Persians. And to the west, for example, when they faced off against Spain, would be Western Christians, likely many of these people having ancestry from different German groups, such as the Visigoths. Okay, the reasons why the Islamic armies were so successful. First, the Byzantines did not possess any superior military hardware. The Byzantines had siege engines that were impressive, but this was not useful for repelling Muslim attacks. Thus, the Byzantines, they had these huge devices for pulling up to a walled garrison, and these siege engines would be devices used to pound away at the walls, and thus one could conquer a garrison. But this is not really of any much use in any kind of battle with the Muslims. Both Christians and their opponents, the Muslims, they both fought with swords, lances, axes, and bows. The Byzantine Christians had no advantage when it came to weaponry. Two, the Byzantine soldiers were not as well trained. Many soldiers, many of the Byzantine soldiers were foreigners motivated by pay and not for any sense of loyalty. And actually, some of the foreigners were Arabs who, in some cases, actually deserted the Byzantines and joined the Muslims. Third reason why the military expansion of Islam was so impressive, was so successful. Both Byzantine and Persian armies were mostly composed of fortress troops that were better for static warfare rather than offensive campaigns. In other words, when it came to the soldiers of the Christians, they were mostly soldiers who were trained to be stationed at a garrison, at a walled location, and they did not have that training for the battlefields such as what the Muslims had. And also, they lacked a sufficient cavalry. They did not really take advantage of having a cavalry, having a good number of horses for flanking movements in battle. Whenever the Muslims lured their enemies into desert battle, the Muslims were able to outmaneuver their opponents. And the Muslims were good at this type of battle, and secondly, the Christians were not very good at this sort of encounter. 4. In contrast to Christian and Persian soldiers, the Arab Muslim fighters learned fighting at an early age. Moreover, they often were organized in close-knit small units of men from the same tribe. So it was common for them to fight alongside their relatives and childhood friends. And just that sense of familiarity and just knowing your fellow men, your fellow soldiers, and also having that blood connection was advantageous for the Muslims when it came to encountering their enemies. A fifth reason why the military campaigns of the Muslims was successful: Muslim invaders had the advantage of land mobility with camels. And with the Muslims, all the Muslim soldiers had camels. They all traveled by camels or by horses. They also had horses. And this was the equivalent of a mechanized force that could outpace opposing armies, the opposing armies being mostly on foot. The Muslims would target weak sections of enemy lines, confident that they could escape any counter movements by reinforcements that might outnumber them. And it was often the case where the Christians had as many, if not more, soldiers on the field. But the Muslims were well well trained, and they had this mobility with the camels. And it was really only the Muslims that had this, high degree of mobility in the desert. Interestingly, the Muslim armies themselves were not huge, tended to be modest in size. Rarely were their Muslim armies larger than 10,000 soldiers. And many of their armies was even in the 2,000 to 3,000 range number of soldiers. But again, having that speed on the field would more than make up for any loss in numbers against their opponents. They could go in, they could hit those weak spots of their opponents, and then they could just leave the scene very quickly before the Christians got their forces ready to counter what the Muslims were doing. 6. This is my final point of reason why the Islam armies were so successful. The Muslim armies also had excellent leadership. And a lot of it was that military promotion was by merit rather than bloodlines. We see it often in history where officers and higher ranked soldiers would have received their station, their place in the army based on their father's name and wealth. But this, with the Muslims, it was not based on who you were, but what you did and how successful you were as a fighter. And this resulted in excellent leadership. In Muslim traditions, the world was divided, is divided into the House of Islam and the House of War. Muslim government and law rule in the House of Islam. The House of War represents the world ruled by infidels, not non-believers. From the Prophet, a task bequeathed to Muslims was jihad, interpreted from the Quran to mean both moral striving and armed struggle. In most of recorded Muslim history, quote, jihad was most commonly interpreted to mean armed struggle for the defense or advancement of Muslim power, end of quote. From this, there is the presumption that, quote, the duty of jihad will continue interrupted only by truces until all the world either adopts the Muslim faith or submits to Muslim rule. Again, a lot of this material I'm getting from the scholarship of Bernard Lewis. For Muslims, the link between religious truth and political power was very close. Religious truth sanctifies political power, and political power sustained religious truth. Historically, Muslims almost always saw their opponents not in a sense of territory, but simply as infidels. When they confronted non-believers. It wasn't that the non-believers represented this group of people or that group of people, but instead they were just seen simply as infidels. And I guess if we take it further, if we would take it into modern history and say we take it to the 19th century, during the Ottoman Empire, the opponents would not necessarily be the British or the French or whoever. Instead, it would be the infidels. The want to just say a few words about Christianity, because I'm going to be talking about the Crusades shortly. More so than any other religion, Christianity was a threat to Islam. Unlike the case in other religions, both Christians and Muslims believe that they alone have the truth. Each believed and believes it is their duty to bring their message to the rest of the world. Quote, Christendom and Islam are two religiously defined civilizations that were brought into conflict not by their differences, but by their resemblances. End of quote. What do I mean by that? Well, they both seek to win the world, as opposed to other religions that may not have that evangelism aspect to it. They both seek to win the world. Now, built in 692, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and this was built on the site of the ancient Jewish temple, has the following inscriptions, quote, Praise be to God who begets no son and has no partner, end of quote. Well, the main message is that Islam is the true and correct path, and certainly the Christians are in error with their notion of the Son and the Holy Spirit, the notion of the Trinity. As the Muslim Empire grew, non-Muslims in the conquered lands faced serious difficulties. Despite what Voltaire and other intellectuals of the Enlightenment wrote, Muslim tolerance for non-Muslims was virtually non-existent, at least looking back in this time period. Jews and Christians, that is, the Jews and Christians that were conquered by the Islamic armies, could not build any new churches or synagogues, nor could they pray or read scripture out loud. In fact, they were even prohibited from reading scripture or praying out loud in their own homes. Again, supposedly the fear that a Muslim might hear this. Non-Muslims could not ride horses. There were some allowances they could ride mules, but they could not ride horses, nor could they bear arms. They were also very heavily taxed, certainly severely taxed, much more than Muslims. Rodney Stark cites cases of mass executions of non-Muslims, and he writes that unfortunately these massacres, which were of Jews and Christians, became increasingly common as the decades and centuries unfolded. On the issue of the Crusades, and the Crusades brings us to a little bit of a later period. This is the late 1000s, entering into the 1100s. so the late 11th century, on the issue of the Crusades. This is what historian Derek Lomax wrote. Quote, "The popes, like most Christians, believed war against the Muslims to be justified partly because the latter had usurped by force lands which once belonged to Christians, and partly because they abused the Christians over whom they ruled and such Christian lands as they could raid for slaves, plunder, and the joys of destruction." End of quote. The Crusades began in the year 1095 when Pope Urban II spoke to a large crowd outside Clermont, outside the French city Clermont. The Pope detailed the torture, rape, and murder of Christian pilgrims and the defilement of churches and holy places by Muslims. He encouraged Christian soldiers to respond, quote, "If you are conquered, you will have the glory of dying in the very same place as Jesus Christ, and God will never forget that he found you in the holy battalions." End of quote. Pope Urban II's call for a crusade generated much excitement. Urban held that participation in the crusade was in essence morally equivalent to serving in a monastic order. In other words, crusade participation could be a substitute for the penance of sin. Now, such incentives were helpful because the financial cost of crusading was high. It was costly. A crusading knight required armor, weapons, and a minimum of one war horse and additional pack horses or mules. In addition, crusaders needed money for their families and estates while they were absent as they traveled to Jerusalem. Some crusaders had no choice but to borrow the funds necessary for their crusade. The number who participated in the First Crusade was approximately 130,000. 1/10 of this number were nobles and knights, so approximately 13,000 were nobles and knights. Trained infantrymen represented less than 1/2 of the total, and the remaining participants were non-combatant support people and peasants. The success of the First Crusade was due to the effectiveness of well-trained and well-armed knights. In June of 1099, the Crusaders, and probably about less than 15% of who actually started out initially, these Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem, known as one of the great fortresses of the medieval world. When the Muslims became aware of the approaching Crusaders, they poisoned all the wells around the city. They also expelled Jerusalem's Christian population, which had outnumbered the city's Muslim population. In July, the Crusaders breached the wall, and what followed was brutal fighting within the walls of the city. And there was a massacre of the Muslims. The Muslims were defeated by the Crusaders. Now, Rodney Stark argues that the bloody victory at Jerusalem requires closer analysis, and he considers 3 points. It was no secret to the Crusaders that Muslims carried out many massacres of cities. This was something that they were aware of. Second, a common practice of rule by war is that any city that did not choose to surrender did risk massacre. Third, when there was no surrender, the spoils of war meant unrestrained looting and other violent acts. As one scholar put it, the age was cruel and bloody, but it makes no sense to impose the Geneva Convention on this era. Now, almost 40 years later, Pope Eugene III called for a new crusade. And this second crusade occurred in the years 1147 and 1148. The goal was to bolster the strength of the Crusader kingdoms located on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. Remember, the First Crusade had been successful, and many of the Crusaders who remained had set up these various kingdoms. Now, the situation for the Christians in the Holy Land was precarious due to Muslims and the various raids that they carried out. And the Christians found it virtually impossible to have peace with the Muslims. The Second Crusade actually did not amount to much, but there were 2 important consequences of the crusade. Its failures dampened the crusading movement, and it also emboldened Muslim confidence. Saladin the Turk was a man who rose to become a very powerful leader. In the year 1187, Saladin scored a major victory against the Christians who had made a strategic error in the desert. Thousands died in the battle, and most of the Christian captives were beheaded. When Saladin attacked Jerusalem, the city eventually asked him for surrender terms. His demands were 10, among his demands were 10 gold pieces for each man spared, and he agreed to free 7,000 poor people for the gold. About half of the city's Christians became slaves. The Third Crusade occurred shortly after this. It began in 1189, and the key crusader was Richard the Lionhearted, the King of England. Historians view Richard as an intelligent and calculating commander who was willing to risk his own life. He proved his brilliance in battle near Jerusalem against Muslim forces in September of the year 1191. So he was victorious. But in the end, with spent forces, Richard chose not to attack Jerusalem. He saw it as a military liability. In essence, quote, "Better that the kingdom have secure borders that maximize the effectiveness of its armed forces than that Jerusalem itself be returned briefly to Christian control." Thus, the argument was it really wasn't worth retaking Jerusalem because it probably would be short lived. It was during the Fourth Crusade, which was the years 1202 to 1204, that Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders. And it was also, the Fourth Crusade was seen as a failure because there was no effort whatsoever to recapture Jerusalem. These were the four major crusades. There were several others. The number often quoted is that there were 8 crusades, and but what we see by the end of the, actually by 1270, the crusades had fizzled out. So that was it. So really, it was only the first crusade that could be deemed a clear success. To conclude, the Crusades failed in their primary objectives, and the objective was to expel Islam. That did not happen. Islam remained dominant in the Holy Land. And a second objective was to reunite Western and Eastern Christians. Well, this did not happen. So on those 2 points, one would say that the Crusades had failed in their primary objectives. Thank you.